Hi everyone, welcome to Internal Control Talks. Our goal with this podcast is to help you thrive as internal control professional by bringing you the best advice from industry leaders. Today we will talk about effective communication with Terry Thompson. Terry has over 30 years of experience in internal audit, controls and compliance. He is currently a risk and control consultant for Wells Fargo Bank in North Carolina. Over the course of his career, he worked for several Fortune 500, Private 100, and government organizations such as Duke Energy, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Food Lion, and Alex Lee. Over the last 10 years, he has served in the roles of Chief Audit Executive and Chief Audit Officer for Santee Cooper, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, and the University System of Georgia. In addition, he is a board member of the Atlanta chapter of the Institute of Internal Auditors, a member of the advisory board for the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and a member of the Atlanta chapter of Certified Fraud Examiners. Terry authored articles published by the Institute of Internal Auditors and the Atlanta chapter of Certified Fraud Examiners, and has been featured in the Atlanta Business Chronicle and the Compliance Week magazine. Terry, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Today we talk about effective communication and how to be good listeners and how to be listened to. In one of our previous conversations, we found ourselves in an interesting chat on the importance of communication skills in order to be effective in our job as risk and control professionals. You share with me very insightful lessons learned in your 30 plus years of experience in the field. And this is what led me to invite you to continue the conversation today. You have an extensive experience in communicating to a range of different internal and external stakeholders, from fellow risk and controls professionals to board members, from technical subject matters to audit committees. So which tip would you give to fellow risk and control professionals to be effective listeners?
I would give several tips. In this order, the first thing I would recommend to be an effective listener is to establish an environment that's conducive to listening. One, I would suggest having a meeting in an environment where there's limited distractions. And two, I would make sure I avoid all phone calls, not looking at emails and texts, and just giving my speaker my undivided attention and to listen intently. I would pay attention to the speaker's body language, their inflection, tone, if there's any pauses. Sometimes those are tips and cues, not only in terms of listening with your ears, but listening with your eyes and making sure that there's an opportunity for you to follow up, relevant to the person's, their position or disposition. I would recommend sustain consistent eye contact. I would offer pauses during the conversation to ask questions for clarification. And that is clarifying the who, what, when, where, how, and why to make sure that I've obtained full information from my speaker. My fourth suggestion is I would write down what was stated, and I would repeat back to the speaker to ensure the speaker knows that I was listening, verifying that the message was properly received, and offering the speaker the opportunity to provide further clarification in case there's any gaps or discrepancies. And then finally, again, I would recap the overall conversation to ensure that the key points and details were properly captured.
Thank you very much. I think you touched base on a number of such valuable advice, and especially the first one you said about the environment. I think it's worth to go deep on that because it's something that it's often overlooked. I mean, I don't know in your experience, but in my experience, oftentimes nobody really pays attention to the environment. Nobody plan in advance anything about the environment the conversation is going to be held in.
To take that conversation a little bit deeper, I've had experience when I worked at Wachovia, for example. We had a conference room, but the conference room had windows. And what I noticed sometimes is that individuals were watching what was going outside of the room more so than focusing on what was going on inside of the room. And I think that, of course, parts of the conversation was missed. And so being aware that the environment, affected the person's ability to focus on the conversation, my suggestion would be to make sure that it is truly a closed environment, or at least one, if there are windows, that there's not a lot of movement or opportunity for distraction.
Yeah. And do you have any tips on how to make sure that we select an environment where the person we communicate with is comfortable?
I would probably say in a conference room, office, I would probably have water in the room or some drinks or something that allows the person to relax. I would make sure the temperature is at a decent temperature, maybe 72 degrees. Make sure the chairs are comfortable. All the physical attributes of the space that would make somebody feel at ease. Maybe even suggest, possibly taking the coats off, such that it's not such a formal discussion.
Yeah, definitely. What I've experienced in my own professional life is also that sometimes it's good to match the environment with the level of conversation you are trying to have. So if you're trying to have an informal conversation, it's okay. And actually it works out quite well if you maybe go to a break area where there are some sofas and you just grab a coffee and you have that conversation over coffee. Well, this might not be appropriate if you are discussing an internal control or audit report, and you need a little bit more privacy, a little bit more formality around it.
Yes, agreed. It definitely depends upon the content of the conversation in your audience.
Being aware of the influence of the environment on the conversation, it's really important. And then also you talk about the engagement, so being present, making eye contact, and really truly listen. I'm sure you have seen a lot of people looking at the smartphone or laptop or answering emails or even taking phone conversation during meetings. All these kind of things just convey the wrong message, and the message they convey is, I'm not there, I don't care about what you're saying. Basically, at the end of the day, that's the bottom line, right?
Exactly. And that is why, to be an effective listener, I guess you providing that eye contact allows them to know that you are engaged. And, like I said, either turning your phone off or at least putting your phone away so that you can't see it. It's out of sight. I know there'll be opportunities sometimes. There might be emergency or things of that sort. But for the most part, if your time is blocked out and it's allocated to the time to discuss your audit issues, then you should be very focused on the discussion that you're having.
And regarding body language, so do you have any specific example from your career where you were facing somebody who was speaking and there was some mixed message between what was said and the body language that was used, the clues from the non-verbal communication, and how we can pay more attention to body language and understand messages which are hidden behind words?
Yes. For example, during my career, I had a meeting with safety personnel at a company I work for, Alex Lee. And as we were discussing the audit observations, I noticed that one of the participants was shaking his head sideways, no, indicating that he was in disagreement with an item. He didn't verbally say it, but his body language was saying it. And so I paused the conversation and I basically directed my attention towards him and asked him, what was his concern? And it gave him an opportunity to express what he thought was not quite what we observed, which actually what we stated was correct. But in just observing the room and watching his behavior in that way, it gave me the opportunity to address his thoughts openly with the rest of the participants.
Yeah. The other point you mentioned, asking questions to follow up and make sure you understand correctly. So write down what is said and then just double check that you understand everything correctly and accurately. I think this is really, really important. It is so easy to misunderstand or overlook some details. So I found this recommendation from you really, really spot on, especially for internal control professionals. Do you have, again, another example from your career that might help our listeners to understand how they can use these type of questions to validate their understanding without coming across as aggressive.
Yes, well, we were executing a walkthrough at Santee Cooper. We were talking to leadership about their processes for complying with regulation. And as we were discussing the talking points, what I had noticed as I was writing items down was, there was information that was lacking in terms of timing, who was responsible, things of that sort. And so what I stated was, hey, I'd just like to ask a clarifying question. And I basically asked questions around those two particular areas so that we can fill in the blanks with, more information to make sure that we had comprehensive and total information. And so that we didn't walk away from the meeting and then having to follow up later, asking those questions or requiring a secondary meeting. The other thing it did was it gave the customer the opportunity to say, that's not what I meant, what they said. And so I think in that way, it gets us both on the same page in terms of either I wrote it down in such a way that maybe I didn't write what you stated, or I wrote what you stated, but what you stated was not actually what you meant to say.
Yeah, that's really important to give permission to the speaker to just make sure that the point comes across correctly. And sometimes they don't even realize maybe they said something and they meant something else, like in the case you just mentioned. And another thing that comes into my mind when we talk about being good listeners is that we teach our children to do not interrupt who is talking. And then yet in business world, we are the first one experiencing interrupting other people when they talk.
Mm-hmm. I can take two approaches to that. One is in writing things down, hopefully it gives the speaker the opportunity to finish their thoughts and then follow up on the back end. But sometimes I think that as the listener, we may need to invite ourselves into the conversation before the speaker's finished to say, I don't mean to be disrespectful or to interrupt you. However, I would like to ask a question before you get, too far down the line and I forget. And provide a point of clarification sooner rather than later. I prefer not to do that, honestly, rather just wait, because as I'm writing it down, I kind of have a working idea, but sometimes I feel like in the moment I just need to stop and, get information right then, right there before the person gets too far away from me and I forget, and then I feel bad about coming back later and having to ask the question that I felt like maybe I should have asked sooner.
But I think the way you frame the interruption is also very important. So you are talking about questions to make sure you understand correctly. So just to confirm the understanding, I think this is a brilliant way to interrupt, but then at the same time, it's a way that it does not interrupt for the sake of argument, but it builds added value, I think.
Yes.
If we move on to the second part of our conversation, which is more on how we make sure that we communicate well. So based on your experience, which are the most common mistakes risk and control professionals do when trying to be listened to?
I will start with that talking point we had earlier, which is not allocating sufficient time to the meeting and maintaining a structure for your presentation so that you don't lose your audience's attention. Because I think if you don't allocate sufficient time, you won't cover everything. If you don't use the time wisely, you'll lose their attention somewhere along the way. So that's my first point. The second one is using audit terminology or lingo that your audience may not understand. And so as often as possible, speak in terms that the person that you're talking to will receive the message. Sometimes we create an environment by using our own lingo that people are afraid to ask a question around what we really meant. And of course, the communication fails because they really didn't receive the message in the first place. The third point is not pausing and offering your audience the opportunity to ask questions for clarification to ensure that they receive the message. And I tie that into my next point, which is, sometimes I've been in meetings where people have rambled and they're not succinct. They don't provide a clear, comprehensive, but concise communication to ensure the audiences receive the proper message and maintain their attention at the same time. My next point is not providing factual information and not communicating confidently. And what that does, it may be due to a failure to execute your work sufficiently or obtain sufficient information. And it causes the person you're talking to, I think, to lose a little bit of trust in what you're telling them. And so at some point they may stop listening to you because they don't think that you know what you're talking about. Making sure that you continue to look around the room to make sure that your audience is maintaining eye contact as well. I think I touched upon that in the previous conversation, because depending upon how many people you have in your room, you have a higher probability that somebody's not paying attention. And so to that degree, it gives you the opportunity to see what people are doing and then address that individual or those individuals to keep them engaged by asking them questions. And also going back to pausing, providing points of clarity to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We touched on this earlier, and I'll say this in a different way, not paying attention to people's nonverbal cues, watching their body language. Does the person appear to be listening? Are they slouching? Do they seem to be distracted looking at their phones? Do they just appear generally disinterested or you're not asking questions? Those are the things we need to maintain an awareness of to be listened to effectively, because this, again, provides the opportunity for us to address those individuals in the audience who may appear not to be engaged. One of the things I struggle with, but I figured I'll talk about this anyway, is not setting ground rules. Ground rules being, maybe you provide a communication before the meeting and we specify how much time, what the talking points are, allocating a specific amount of time within the meeting to particular talking points, giving people the opportunity to know up front that they can ask questions, to pause the meeting, that any talking points that may not be discussed during the meeting we'll capture on a whiteboard, put in the parking lot, and we will follow up to make sure that concerns are covered. Another rule of thumb that I try to implement is making sure that people don't overtalk each other. Sometimes people, they want to talk at the same time and others just want to be heard, but we have to be careful as far as professional conduct, that we're not being disrespectful of one another, and making sure that the messages are clearly being heard. When I worked at Santee Cooper, we would have leadership team meetings, and sometimes we would find I would watch the other participants, and there would be sidebar conversations, or one person talking, the other person talking at the same time, and no one was listening. And so the message was never received. And so one of the things I try to do is set, as far as setting ground rules, is pretty much making it clear up front that that is a behavior that we really do not want to engage in. Another point I would have is not using the proper tone or language. And I think you touched upon this earlier, about not using the proper tone or language that may cause your audience to be defensive. Using language that might appear to be accusatory or indicating that the audience is trying to hide something. So for example, the tendency for some audit functions is to use the terms deficiencies or findings. To me, a deficiency says, clearly you're not operating the way that you need to be. Finding might indicate that you're hiding something. So my general tendency is to use a word like opportunity for improvement or observation.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I think people are more receptive and not taking a defensive position when they say, we all have opportunities to improve. That's true. Or if you say observation, whether it's a negative observation or positive observation, it's still an observation.
So neutral words that does not carry the weight of a judgment.
That's exactly right. And also in using observations, and I'm going to talk about the application of them as far as being listened to effectively, is that when you provide balanced communication and you say to your audit customer, these are the things that you're also doing well, it makes them, that positive reinforcement definitely causes them to listen to you. And then they're more prone to listen to the things that are not so positive, but they also feel like this is a balanced approach and it's not got you or everything is bad.
Yeah, that's really important. That's so important. The positive reinforcement, I think it's really key, especially if us as internal control, risk and control professionals want to be seen as business partners, we cannot go in and just list a bunch of things that are not working, right? I mean, we need to be constructive, not only in, okay, these things are not working objectively, we need to state that and also help the company to address these observation, just to use the word that I like from your previous point. But also we need to recognize what they are doing well, and by enforcing it positively, make them stick to that best practice that we observed as well.
Mm-hmm. In adding to that, another thing is in communicating root cause is helping your customer understand that the opportunity for improvement is a result of a certain condition. And it shows them that you've done your due diligence, and you've been thorough in executing your work. And I think that's a good sell to the customer. And then also conveying that you want to help them achieve their goals and objectives. In saying that is making sure that we convey our understanding of their business goals and objectives. I think one of the bigger failures sometimes that we encounter as internal auditors is we understand what we're doing when we say, this is what we perceive as being a concern with observation. I think sometimes what we don't do is get the customer to understand that we do understand their business, we understand their goals, we understand their objectives, what they're trying to achieve, we understand how it ties into the overall mission and vision of the company. And sharing that type of information, sometimes it's educational for them, because sometimes the people you're talking to may not understand it themselves.
Yeah.
And so when you give them that big picture view, it really, I think it energizes them, and it makes them feel like, hey, our auditors really understand what we're trying to do here.
Yes, definitely. It's so important to provide context to what we are doing as risk professionals, and what they are doing as a business, and how we can interact with each other and support each other's objectives, because we are added value. I mean, we want to be an added value function. We really need to see what is their objective, exactly as you said, and make them understand we understand that, and really add value. I really like that, the way you laid it out, and you explained this concept. I think it's so key, and that start the cooperation. Let's start the win-to-win kind of attitude. I found, like, to talk about the objectives, start with the objectives, and really show each other that we are on the same board, and then move on to the more practicalities. But we are both working for the same objective, and we are really trying to find win-win solution.
Mm-hmm. And I'll expound upon that thought. When you have recommendations, for example, that are cross-functional, when you can have two groups or multiples, even beyond two groups, that have a common goal objective, but may not have understood that when you talk about the flow of a process from one function to another, responsibilities, information that flows downstream, share responsibilities. By getting everyone in the same room and having the conversation around the overall goals and objectives, it gives you a common goal in terms of, hey, everyone, we need to be on the same page about what we're trying to accomplish here. Our audit results are telling us that there are some disconnects between one group to the other. And by bringing you all together, it helps us sort out collectively and as a team, what corrective action should be taken to help us achieve those organizational goals and objectives. Sometimes that provides a greater benefit too, because it makes sure everyone understands we're aiming for the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gives them an opportunity to say, okay, audit, we understand you, we hear you, this is what we're doing, group number one, group number two, this is what we're doing, group number three. And then it engages them in terms of, okay, so where do we have a disconnect? And it might provide an opportunity in that conversation that maybe there's something that didn't even come up in the audit, depending upon the questions were asked and whom they were asked to.
Yeah.
So it gives leadership in their groups the opportunity to have more engaged conversation.
Yeah, no, that's such a valid point, I think, and always keeping in mind the objective and trying to understand everyone's objective is so important. And jumping back, I love what you said about, make sure you allocate sufficient time to talk about every single point, and also be structured in the way you interact with people. So if there is a meeting, there's going to be an agenda, there's going to be time allocation for each point, and it's very clear. And I think that gives a great framework for people to express themselves, and at the same time trying to be concise and not use too many words to explain ideas, so that then people start to do something else. And in my personal experience, I found it quite challenging to establish such framework for talks, for meetings, when I am dealing with companies which have this culture which is very informal. Maybe they are startup, maybe they are small companies where everyone knows each other. However, when it comes to organizing meetings, structuring meetings, sending out agendas, and trying to make people stick to the time frame and the discussion point, it's a little bit more challenging when compared to big corporations where this is kind of the standard practice. But when conversations are usually more informal, I find it's not always easy to strike a balance between the company culture and being effective in time management and communication.
That's an excellent point. You speaking to culture, and like you said, a more informal culture. I think what I found, once I've gotten a feel for the culture itself, and this applies sometimes even in corporate, depending upon what business function you're dealing with, whom you're dealing with, is sometimes I might allocate more time to the meeting, because I understand that there's going to be some people who want to have more casual conversations. They're going to want to engage, or they might even want to digress a little bit. But I think for the health and the balance of the relationship is to, in understanding the nature of the participants, is giving that time to them, so that they don't feel rushed. They don't feel like it is more formal than they would like for it to be, and just adapting to the situation.
And would you go with an approach with agenda and set up meetings, or would you keep it more informal? Like, for example, then do not put it out there and just trying to touch base on all the points, but keeping the conversation informal and not sharing the agenda up front. What would you suggest?
I would state the latter part of what you just said, which is I probably would still have my own list of things. So I would have a document, talk point, and still, have a professional presentation, but not as formal in terms of providing it to them, and just talking through it, and just making sure that I try to keep control of the time, state my points, then ask, are there any questions, and just continue. And then if things get off course, give them a couple of minutes to be off course, and then dial it, basically bring it back to the point that we were trying to discuss.
I've done that a few times because I've tried to move from a more informal way to a bit more formal and try out different things and see what works. And I found that overall what you were recommending, it's what works the majority of the time in that kind of specific type of situations where culture is very informal. And I just want to go back to a couple of other points that you made earlier. The verification of the information, so the factual information, make sure you got your facts right before talking. And also I would add something to that as well. Be ready means doing your homework. I'm really big on this because I've seen so many times people who show up at meetings say, oh, okay, I need to do the walkthrough for the purchasing to pay process. Can you tell me how that works? Open, very, very open questions, no preparation whatsoever. So I'm really big with the people I work with on doing your homework. So getting your hands on every possible documents which you can read before every audit report, procedure, anything, and then going to the meeting ready. And then ask, obviously, if the information is still relevant, if there is any change, and whether you can ask any follow-up question, and take it from there and build a conversation on that instead of just going blank and say, oh, what about that? Big question mark. very, very broad topic, which I feel in my experience puts the other person, usually process owner, control owner, in a position where he thinks, oh, I need to explain this for the 10th time. The guy doesn't have any clue about what he's doing, why he's here, and what we are trying to achieve here. He cannot provide me any added value because, he doesn't know anything. Do you have any tips on be ready and be professional and show that we are there, prepared to add value?
Well, I'll tell you what I used to do when I worked at MARTA, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. As chief auditor, I would have group discussions, the team, staff, the manager, director, and myself. And we would sit in a room together. And I would already have read the audit report, for example. And I would put track changes in, I would ask questions within the document. And so as we went through, I would always look for key content, criterion, what was the policy, procedure, law, regulation, practice? What was the observation? Was that clear? Did we properly capture the numbers? Were we accurate about how we conveyed the issue itself? Did we identify the root cause thoroughly to make sure that the recommendation, of course, which follows, addresses that root cause? And then we address the impact as far as non-compliance with a financial regulation, which could result in a final penalty. Where we not achieve our organizational goals, whether they were financial, operational, or otherwise. I would try to make sure that the person who wrote the report captured all this information. I would try to look at it from a high level and give it in that way to say, if I'm management and I'm sitting on the other side of the table, these are some of the things that I may ask you. And this is from my experience in dealing with high-level management. So I'm going to try to present to you a reality in terms of what you might face when you go into the room with them. And virtually, I would just pick it apart and make sure that they did have a clear understanding of the risks, of the objectives. Did they identify the proper relevant controls relevant to my knowledge and experience, or what I know about the organization at that time, so that they had full, comprehensive, detailed, airtight information to provide to management. The other thing I would do is I would make sure that, the work papers had been properly reviewed, and that they did follow up with management and the staff they audited before they ever talked to me about that report, and before they ever talked to higher level management, our customers, about the report. Because at the detail level, they need to make sure that they did understand clearly and correctly what it was, and that they got confirmation that the observations that were made, in fact, were accurate. Because the last thing you want to do is have a misunderstanding, or did not give the customer the opportunity to say, no, that's not quite right, or that's not right at all, or it is right. And then make sure that once you put it together, give those individuals the opportunity to review a draft, or at least a summary, to say, this is the way we're writing it. Here's the content, here's the tone, here are all the facts. Is this appropriate? Because I think the last thing we want to do is present it to their boss and blindside them, or present to their boss and maybe not even blindside them, but still it's not quite what it needs to be in terms of how we conveyed it. So that's pretty much the way I would go about doing it. And there's times I've had to send my staff back to do more work.
Yeah, you don't really want to be in that position where you are in a meeting and you are questioned and you don't have an answer, right? So I think the point you made early to, try to kind of role play and think about any possible question the person you're going to talk to might ask, from more basic to a bit more complicated, and lay out an answer that you can give if that question is asked. I think it's really key. And if you already thought through, then you have a good answer to the point.
And here's another benefit that goes beyond even the communication itself, and it's the development of the staff. By having the different levels of management and staff in the room, the staff gets to understand what I'm thinking is the CAE. I also get to evaluate the type of feedback that the staff is getting from their management or leadership team. And so when it comes time for performance evaluations, I know how to develop people from the next level below and be the next level below that, all the way down to the staff level. And so we should all be in lockstep in terms of the development, make sure we're on the same page in the growth, such that each of these levels should then anticipate, possibly what is he going to ask me? What is he going to say? And as I receive more and more reports, I should have less and less questions.
Definitely, yeah, it's a great way to learn and to teach other people, and also to go deeper in the technical topics as well. So it's got a variety of different benefits. It's a really good tool, what you were doing, and I'm sure that other professionals can adopt the same tool to improve the communication, teaching, and understanding of the topics. And just to wrap up, is there any book resource on the topic of effective communication that you found particularly useful in your career as risk and control professional?
Truthfully, I do not have any. I rely pretty much mostly on my experiences, not just mine, but actually the experiences of watching others and listening to others, and just taking tips and trips from my management team, whether I was a younger staff auditor, and also from my staff when I rose to a higher level, just getting feedback, from my peers, and asking them, are there any observations or feedback you'd like to provide relevant to the conversations that we had? There's plenty of books out there. I mean, the IIA has books, Barnes and Noble's, regular bookstore. But I think relevant to your profession and your general personal life, I think that's where you get a lot of your, I'll just say experience.
Barry, thank you very much for being with us today to share your experience and to provide our audience with such valuable takeaways.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, make sure you like it and share it. If you want even more resources on how to be extra effective as internal control professional, check out our website www.internalcontroltoolbox.com and subscribe to the email list. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.